Welcome back to Ye Olde Guide, and in this episode we're taking a trip to the seaside for sand, slot machines, crazy golf and chips, to one of England's classic seaside resorts. No, it's not Blackpool, Broadstairs or Bognor Regis, but rather a town which boasts a less well-known, historic maritime facade. A town which was once a centre of global fisheries, a strategic naval centre, and one of England's wealthiest towns in the Middle Ages. We're visiting Great Yarmouth. And travelling along the wherry lines with me is historian, migration expert, football fanatic and all-round Great Yarmouthphile, Daniel Gooch. So Daniel, how would you rate a day out in Yarmouth?
I'd rate it very highly. I've had a lot of days out in Great Yarmouth, as I know you have as well. We both grew up very close to there, and it was kind of the premier seaside resort if you're an East Anglian. And we went back there to research this, and probably the most fun day out I think I've had researching for this podcast.
And as we'll see in this episode, people from around the country went to Great Yarmouth for their holidays throughout the 20th century. So we'll be talking more about that. For new listeners to Ye Olde Guide, or Yog as it's known to its friends, welcome. And here is how the show works. We explore a town in England and we look at its historical significance in four broad categories: culture, politics and war, science and industry, and urban heritage. We talk about the places and sites you can discover in the town, and then we'll give our own totally objective and scientific score for historical significance. And at the end, we have a bonus category called reality versus expectations. This will all make much more sense as we go through the podcast. And more information about the podcast and about other places we've visited can be found on our website, yeoldeguide.com. You can also go there to feedback on this and all our other episodes. But for now, before we get into the categories, let's start, Daniel, with an overall view of Great Yarmouth.
Great Yarmouth, it's the third largest town in Norfolk, which is a county in, as we mentioned, East Anglia, over on the east of England. It's got a population
the bum of England.
That's
the bum that sticks out of England.
Yeah, if you're looking at a map, that's the best way to think of it, I think, to identify East Anglia. Its population's around 40,000. It's most famous in modern times as holiday and a seaside resort, but historically was a major national centre of the fishing industry. It reached its relative peak in wealth and influence probably in the Middle Ages, when actually tax records from the 1330s have it as the fourth most prosperous town or city outside London in the whole country, i.e. the town which was fourth in how much tax it contributed to the national coffers. Even as late as the 18th century, Daniel Defoe, whose famous novel Robinson Crusoe starts with a storm off the coast of Yarmouth, was able to describe it as an ancient town, much older than Norwich, and for wealth, trade and advantage of its situation, infinitely superior to Norwich. He also called it a beautiful town.
Infinitely superior.
Yep, absolutely. And Norwich is
That's
the town
what we like to hear.
Yep. The herring industry, it declined to practically nothing by the late 20th century, but it now has a burgeoning industry in offshore wind energy production and still remains one of the top seaside resorts in the country.
Like many seaside resorts, it's had its fair share of decline. People started flying off to the Canary Islands and so on. It does feel like it's retained a lot of its character and a lot of its charm, and it's still a great place to visit. It's right on the east coast of England. I think it's the second most easterly town, I think, after Lowestoft. Right there facing the North Sea. And the town itself is situated on quite a narrow spit, one side facing the North Sea and one side facing the River Yare. But that's not always been the case, is that right?
Yeah, I think the town of Great Yarmouth as it is now didn't really exist, didn't physically exist as a kind of mainland location until around about 900 AD. Because until that point, the sand spit on which it rests was all completely underneath the sea. And it's quite interesting, if you look at Great Yarmouth today, there is a Roman fort just off to the west of the town. It kind of sits on the very, very western edge of what could be described as Great Yarmouth suburbs. But even though it's so far inland, it was actually built, when it was built by the Romans, it was actually on the coast. So you can just see from that just how far the town has expanded outwards into the sea over the years.
Yarmouth itself is part of a broader urban area which includes Goulston-on-Sea, which is just on the opposite side of the Yare. And we'll mostly be focusing on Yarmouth, but it is part of this larger urban area on the east coast of Norfolk. So thanks, Dan, for that overview. And I think now we'll get into our categories. In our first category, culture, we explore the influences of the town in the worlds of art, film, literature, entertainment. And this really gets to the heart of Great Yarmouth today and throughout its modern history as a resort centre. How and when did Yarmouth emerge as a resort?
I think Yarmouth's main kind of peak as a seaside resort is pretty closely associated with the rise of leisure and tourism for the working classes. The entertainment industry started there really at the end of the 18th century, particularly when the sea baths were built in 1759. So it kind of initially started to take a similar trajectory to some of the more kind of early middle class or aristocratic leisure resorts, such as we saw in the Bath episode. But when mass tourism arrived, when the railways came and they allowed people to travel around, when poorer people had more disposable income, this is really when Great Yarmouth came into its own, particularly when the first railway station was built in 1844, because directly after this, it only took 14 years from this date when the two brand new piers were built, and there was a lot of growth in permanent leisure facilities from that point on. So I think you can say the big social catalysts were greater spending power for working classes and the arrival of easier travel facilities across the country.
And people travelled for their holidays from all over the land. And I've read stories of thousands of tourists coming from the Midlands, places like Burton, travelling huge distances to come to Yarmouth for factory weeks. This was, as you say, enabled by the railways, as it was for all resort towns. So what did that resort town boom leave as a legacy in terms of buildings and attractions in Yarmouth?
What you have is quite a lot of really important seaside cultural icons. I think we can just look at some of the most important ones now. You have the promenade there, of course. You also have the Winter Garden, which is a huge kind of iron and glass Victorian building. It was actually originally built in Torquay in the late 1870s and then moved to Great Yarmouth in 1904. It's a really kind of vast, grand building. I think I most recently went there years ago and it was a nightclub run by Jim Davidson. But it's also been used for concerts, indoor children's play area. And it was added to, unfortunately, the Victorian Society's top 10 endangered buildings list in 2018. So its future is not certain, but it's a fantastic legacy of that period of Great Yarmouth's history. But of course, we also have to talk about the fun fairs, because that's what we all really go to Great Yarmouth for.
Yep.
Now, my favourite ride in Great Yarmouth is the Scenic Railway, which I think is probably yours as well, Liam.
Oh, I think it might be my favourite ride in the world.
It's absolutely fantastic. The Scenic Railway is Grade 2 listed. It's the only operational scenic railway type roller coaster in the UK. And the way to think of this is that it's a vast, huge wooden track with cars that go along it, actually controlled by a brakeman, which is very, very rare. Someone has to ride on it and actually operate a brake.
There's very few left in the world with a brakeman.
No, absolutely.
Maybe 8 roller coasters left in the world with a brakeman.
Yep, and this is
add to the terror. And
this is the only operational scenic railway that's in the UK. It was actually originally built for the Paris Colonial Exhibition in 1929, but the owner of Pleasure Beach, Pat Collins, bought it and had it shipped over to England, where it opened in 1932. And it's the third oldest roller coaster of any type in England today. And if you want to see it in another sphere, then you have a look at the House of Fun video by Madness. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but right at the end, they're riding on the roller coaster, going around it. You can actually see the original mountain kind of alpine scenery that it was painted in at the time. It looks a little bit different from today. But this is really
it's been repainted.
Yeah, it has, and kind of this, I think, blue starry theme. It has been like that since, I think, the 80s. But this is really just one example of Yarmouth's amazing collection of Victorian, Edwardian, pre-war entertainment heritage. I think we should talk about the Venetian waterways as well.
Yes, we should. Recently restored and recently reopened Venetian waterways. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. This is a kind of public gardens and small man-made collection of man-made canals which go around it, which were built in the 1920s as part of a work creation scheme. You can go round on a boat, and as you said, they've recently been restored with a lottery grant. The waterways were desilted, and the gardens and cafe have been restored. Other things to look at, the Hippodrome. Hippodrome built in 1903 by George Gilbert. It's one of only 2 purpose-built circuses in England still in operation, and I think the only one in the world which has a floor which sinks into the pool to allow water shows. Possibly only one in the country, actually. There might be only 3 in the world, but it's still very, very rare. Most circuses you'd think of as being temporary big top tents that can be moved, but no, this is there as a permanent building that you can visit.
Well, that's incredible. And are there any other... I mean, my recollection of the promenade in Great Yarmouth, it goes on for quite a long way. I think they call it the Golden Mile. So you've got this beautiful sandy beach, which is what's led to all this. And then you've just got a succession of attractions. You've got the pleasure beach with all its history, but it also, to be fair, has lots of modern rides as well. And then you've got a little model village, smaller fun fairs. You've got miniature golf. You've got a sea life centre. You've got the winter gardens and 2 piers. When were the piers built? And is there anything significant about them, would you say?
Well, the Wellington Pier was built in 1853. I think it was partially demolished about 15 years ago. And the Britannia Pier opened in 1858. What's important is that you've got one of the last still going end of the pier theatres there. I think that's on the Wellington Pier, which you can just walk up to, still go into today. And they've always got the big posters up outside with who's coming, whether it's the Chuckle Brothers. Previously, we've had Jim Davidson, Jimmy Cricket, and kind of all the usual seaside icons, but also you've got people like Jimmy Carr that are there as well. He was on there last time I looked. So yeah, also really important buildings. I'm going to mention one more ride, if that's okay, if you don't mind me indulging myself.
Please, feel free.
My personal favourite is the tubs in Joyland, not in Pleasure Beach, up the other end. These were built in 1949. They're called a Virginia reel, that's the style, which is a spinning roller coaster in which you sit in tubs which kind of spin round and zigzag down a track from the top. And it's actually the only remaining example in the entire world of a Virginia reel. It's a miniature version. The original ones mostly were much, much bigger than this, but it's still absolutely unique and has barely really changed since it opened. This style was invented by Horace Cole, whose family owned and still owns the park. He actually designed the snails, another ride there, like a little children's ride where you ride in a snail that goes up and down the track.
Oh, I remember the snails.
And the local industrial link, they were built in his own engineering works in Great Yarmouth, both rides.
So I think the listeners have got a feel for our enthusiasm for the Yarmouth Beach. So please do visit. I mean, I kind of want to go back now, and I've been there loads of times. Before we move on, I want to come back to that roller coaster because it's just so terrifying. Do you know what a head chopper is?
The head chopper is the bit where I always duck. I'll let you explain it, but it's terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying. So I believe it's one of the most terrifying roller coasters in the world because of the brakeman and the head chopper. Could talk about Pleasure Beach all day, but let's move on. We couldn't get through an episode of Ye Olde Guide without mentioning a football ground. What's significant about the football stand in Great Yarmouth?
Well, I don't think many people would associate Great Yarmouth with football instantly. I think the local team plays in the Eastern Counties League. I can't remember who sponsors that. It might be Ridgeons, possibly. It used to be Jewsons back in my day. But that you're talking about kind of 9th, 10th division football here. But their ground is hugely important because it contains the oldest football stand in the world, which is still in use. It opened in 1892. It seats about 500 and it's Grade 2 listed, has been since 2000. If you look at it, it doesn't really look like a modern football stand. It almost has kind of the appearance of a railway station, I'd say. It has that kind of brick and wood Victorian railway station appearance to it, but it's still there, still being used. Really, really important part of our national sporting heritage.
It's actually beautiful, so I would recommend having a look on Google Images if you haven't seen it before. So Yarmouth's got it's got a famous greyhound and horse racing track, but moving away from sport to the world of literature, Yarmouth has got 2 quite significant literary associations.
I think the first one to talk about is probably Anna Sewell. Anna Sewell, who wrote Black Beauty, I should explain, she wrote Black Beauty, which was the first book ever to be written from the perspective of an animal and to carry an ethical kind of message about animal rights. She was born in Great Yarmouth, and although she didn't live there for long, her birthplace is now a museum there. And I suppose if you had someone born there who'd written one of the best-selling books ever, I think it's well within the top 20 of best-selling books ever, you would want to celebrate their life, and it's fantastic that they do that. Other literary connections. In Charles Dickens, David Copperfield visits Great Yarmouth as a child. He describes an enormous storm that hits the town, similar to what we mentioned earlier. Robinson Crusoe, the opening of Daniel Defoe's great novel, is set off the coast of Yarmouth with this kind of wild imagery of savage seas, almost kind of dangerous and adventurous at the same time. But also in what I found interesting about Charles Dickens's depiction of Great Yarmouth is in how much detail he describes the town. It's multi-sensory. He describes the sounds of carts, he describes the smell of fish, the pride local people have in how important and great their town is. It's a really great depiction of 19th century Great Yarmouth.
That's right. And we will be coming back to the smell of fish in the science and industry section,
Definitely.
I'm sure. Is there anything else we should pick up in culture, or are we ready to go on to the scores?
I'll just mention one more thing, which is another potential first here. Great Yarmouth may have had the oldest recorded purpose-built theatre in England. We have to add some asterisks and caveats to this. What we're talking about here is the Game Place House on what is now Priory Plain, which was first mentioned in 1539, which is 38 years before the first known playhouse was even established in London. It's not absolutely certain from the records available to us whether this was definitely a theatre. It could possibly have been just a place where actors and spectators could get refreshments, and plays might have taken place outside, which was quite common at the time. And it didn't last all that long, because the records described as simply decayed by 1594, so we're talking about 55 years later there. But if any new evidence ever comes to light on this, it'd be fantastic to know, because it will be a really major national first there.
It would. Okay, then, so on to the scores. So for new listeners, this is the bit where we attempt to sort of score the town for historical significance in the category. And shall I go first?
Yeah, please do.
Yes. So I am going to give Great Yarmouth quite a high score. I'm going to give it a 7. And the reason why is because I think this seaside resort and all the buildings that come with it, including the pleasure beach, the hippodrome, it's so significant in the leisure activities that normal people, working class people, in vast quantities enjoyed. It's brought so much fun to a wide range of people, and it's done on such scale, and critically, there's still so much of it that you can see in Yarmouth. You can still do it, and it has that wonderful blend of nostalgia, historic significance, and it's there. You can do it yourself. It's open. So, and along with those literary references, which gives it some breadth beyond the resort, I'm going with a 7.
My feelings on Great Yarmouth are very, very similar. I mean, we looked slightly earlier about how its start as a resort town was kind of laid on similar foundations as for Bath, and it did have some urban regeneration in vaguely similar neoclassical themes, which we'll look a bit more at later. But eventually they went in different directions. Bath was always really, at that time, a playground for the wealthy, for the gentry at first and the middle classes. But Great Yarmouth rose to its peak later and was really a resort for the working classes. They gained more time, more spending power, and that was later augmented by the rise of mass transport. And I think what's important about the legacy we're left with today is they're not just what they mean to us today. They're not just part of a present-day seaside front, but a really important part, as you mentioned, of British social history. I almost feel like perhaps we're a bit too close to it at the moment, but I think lots of these will be seen as utterly iconic buildings by future students of 20th century social history. Some of the amazing collection of modern and Victorian Edwardian entertainment heritage. As for the kind of the rides themselves, they're not exactly the most exciting of rides for thrill seekers, but for our historical analysis, I have to say there's a real timeless charm about them. When I went, I took my little daughter there. She went on rides with my dad. There's 3 generations there who've all gone on exactly the same rides, experienced it exactly the same way, things that have barely changed, and all getting exactly the same childlike enjoyment out of them. I think there's something that's really important and quite unique about the heritage that's been left there and the way you can actually enjoy it in a real sense today. So I think that's the main thing. The other stuff, the literary links, are a good bonus. The football stand obviously biases me a little bit more. I'm going to give it a 7.5. I think because this is slightly subjective, but the fact it's got the oldest football stand in the country is going to give it that extra, or the world, I should say, the extra little half mark. So I think, yeah, great score so far. 14.5 out of 20 overall for Great Yarmouth.
Our second category looks at the influence of Great Yarmouth in national politics and its involvement in war and conflict. Yarmouth isn't really known as a centre of political power, but its strategic location has led to its involvement in plenty of maritime history.
Well, Yarmouth's naval history, I think, probably goes back to... I'm going to pick 1297 as our starting point, when there was a local naval battle with Kent fishermen. Basically, certain ports in Kent had joint control of the important herring fair at Great Yarmouth. People in Great Yarmouth did not like that. The control was given initially for reasons concerning who actually did the fishing. Kent boats would go up to the coast of Yarmouth and fish there. And this led to several skirmishes, but a major one in 1297 where roughly 30 ships were lost at sea. There were other skirmishes later, but there seems to have been a particularly brutal element of a general kind of trade of interregional piracy around the country around this time. And really, almost following on since then, there's been this military tradition of Yarmouth being a staging point or a production point or a supply point for British naval battles which happened near the coast of England. Ones that I'll pick out are the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1673, and we're not going to go into the background of that war because it would take far too long. But the English army launched an attack, or the English Navy, I should say, launched an attack on Zealand from Great Yarmouth. And then later on, Great Yarmouth became the main supply base for the North Sea Fleet during wars with France, the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. Yarmouth, essentially, as the supply base, kept the Navy at sea. And it was also, as well as the supply base, the launch base for the British fleet for various battles in the Napoleonic Wars. The physical infrastructure in Yarmouth was changed as well. It had an armory, a barracks, various other permanent naval buildings, many of which were destroyed during World War II, unfortunately. However, the Royal Naval Hospital, which opened in 1811, still survives and it's been converted into flats. There's also another remnant, an 18th century cannon on the South Quay in Yarmouth, and this had a real impact on the town. Population increased by about 25% in the 10 years from 1801 to 1811, thanks to all this construction work to support the navy that happened there. Other battles we can talk about going back further in history, to a time when there wasn't really standing navy at all in England. The Battle of Sluis, I think it's pronounced, it's Dutch, I've done my best to pronounce it correctly, where there was a fleet comprising many Yarmouth mariners and ships, which defeated the French and Genoese force in June 1340, which was an important battle in the 100 Years' War. The reason Yarmouth was so important as a launching point was because it was the largest port in the country at the time, so really ideally located for launching a force eastward, but also because, as we mentioned earlier, there was a huge shipbuilding industry there. The shipbuilding industry helped to provide the construction works for ships for a navy when there wasn't a standing navy in the country at the time. So for various reasons, Yarmouth's always been an important location for the English Navy. And
therefore an association inevitably with Nelson.
Absolutely. Well, Lord Nelson was from Norfolk. He visited the town a lot. He had one of the most famous and best described visits is this kind of glorious acclamation in 1800 when he arrived following a trip across Europe. There were flags, pennants, massed crowds, and Nelson made a speech where he said, "I'm a Norfolk man and glory in being so." I was tempted to do that in the accent, but I'm not sure what the Norfolk accent would have been like back then. He was made a freeman of Great Yarmouth, so he was clearly very popular there. Yarmouth was important militarily for him as well. It was the staging point for the Battle of Copenhagen. Nelson's fleet set off from there and arrived back there. And his legacy is celebrated in Yarmouth today in the original Nelson's column. So there's the famous one in London, Trafalgar Square, but the Nelson Monument in Yarmouth was built in 1817, 21 years before the one in Trafalgar Square. So if you tell someone you're going to see the original Nelson's Column, you need to go to Great Yarmouth to see it.
It's only 8 metres shorter than the London one, so it looks pretty similar. It's also known as the Norfolk Naval Pillar. It's in a bit of an off location, quite far south on the spit and surrounded by industrial buildings, but nevertheless an impressive monument and quite surprising when you come across it. I gather it opens on occasion, so you can climb up the monuments.
Absolutely. And there was a Norfolk Nelson Museum in Great Yarmouth until very recently, but I think it closed within perhaps even the last year, which is a shame. But he's also memorialised in several roads named after him as well. There's Nelson Road, Nelson Lane, various roads like that.
So we do have some buildings to sort of commemorate Yarmouth's significance. The Naval Hospital you've mentioned, Nelson's Column, but also the aerial bombing of Yarmouth in the 20th century has left a significant mark on the structure of the town. Yarmouth was quite significant for being the first place to suffer an aerial bombing in the First World War. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Great Yarmouth was actually the first place in the whole of the UK to ever suffer an aerial attack. This wasn't an aeroplane, it was a Zeppelin in 1915, a Zeppelin ship. This was in St Peter's Plain in Great Yarmouth, in the centre of the town. You can actually go there now and see a plaque on the wall of the house where the bomb hit. So real kind of significance there. But also, even during World War II, Great Yarmouth, as you mentioned, was pretty heavily attacked. And one of the reasons was simply bad luck, bad location. The Luftwaffe, when they were flying back to their base in Germany, Great Yarmouth was often the last significant town, significant trading or military location they would go over. So they'd simply drop their spare bombs there on their way back home. So there was quite a kind of disproportionate amount of damage wrought to Great Yarmouth during the Second World War.
And this has affected the urbanism a little bit, which we'll come on to. Are there any other political or military influences we should pick up, or any other buildings that we haven't discussed already?
I think the last important one I want to mention is concerns the Civil War. And I know we talk about the Civil War in every episode, but we've got a bit of a different angle to it here. During the Civil War, East Anglia was really the parliamentarian heartland. This was their stronghold. And in Great Yarmouth, one of their leaders owned a house there, which is still there, called the Elizabethan House, which has been converted into a museum, which you can visit today. It was owned by a local merchant called John Carter. And the parliamentarian leaders, including Oliver Cromwell, used to meet regularly at the Elizabethan House to discuss their plans, just have general kind of leadership meetings, really. And supposedly it was at this house where, in November 1648, they made their final decision to execute Charles I.
That's pretty significant.
That's very significant. One of the most momentous decisions ever taken in the history of kind of British warfare or politics was possibly taken in Great Yarmouth. I think we have to add a bit of a caveat to this. I don't think anyone knows for certain, because I don't think anyone was taking detailed minutes which survived to today. It's just supposition that this is where they were meeting at the time, and it's likely that the decision would have been taken there. But there's significant basis to the supposition.
Brilliant. So on to the scores. And I believe it's your turn to go first.
Frankly, for a town of a population of 40,000, where you wouldn't begin to think there could be some kind of political or military history here, I think there's a huge amount going on, certainly much more than I would ever have expected before researching this. And also Yarmouth has kind of a different angle, a different approach. It's really too remote in England to have been involved in very many land battles, hence why we haven't gone down the usual approach of seeing Civil War battles or anything like that. But its involvement in naval warfare really can't be understated. And this involvement has led to the construction of permanent buildings, communication systems. There are nearby Roman forts as well. Garriononum and Burr Castle Roman forts are nearby. So it shows just how strategic a location it's been for sea defence and warfare for such a long time. And the shipbuilding industry as well really feeds into this. But in the days before Henry VIII, when England had no standing navy, in times of hostility, local resources here meant coastal towns could be mobilised to provide boats for the royal forces. So even before it was ever decided that Great Yarmouth would be a military or naval centre. It was still, just by virtue of its local specialisations in industry, providing resources for the defence and of the country and for military battles. Politically, there's perhaps less to say, but this angle with the Civil War, the fact that potentially one of the most momentous decisions in British political and military history was taken in Great Yarmouth, is really, really significant. I'm going to temper it a bit. It's not quite as high in culture because there's less going on in the political side, but I still think it's positive. I'm going to give it a 6.
So there's more than I expected, and there's lots of interesting stuff there, and there's artefacts that you can see, such as the Pillar, the Royal Naval Hospital. So, I'm also going to go with a 6. In the third category, science and industry, we look at how our town has contributed to the success of a major industry or scientific achievement. Visitors to Yarmouth today may not know that the town was once a centre of global fisheries for many years, and this has left an indelible mark on Yarmouth's urbanism. Tell us more about the herring industry.
Fishing for herring happened off the coast of Great Yarmouth before the town even existed. We talked earlier about how the physical location of the town was under sea until about the 9th or 10th century AD. But even as long as ago as the 6th century, fishing was happening off the coast of Yarmouth, which makes it one of the oldest fishing centres in the whole of Northern Europe. It grew to such an extent that it was on its own the main supplier of herring to England in the Middle Ages, and hence one of the most productive fishing centres in the whole of Europe. One of the reasons it became so successful was because herring was an ideal catch because it could be preserved in salt. So you caught it, you didn't have to eat it straight away, you could just transport it off and sell it at markets and fairs across the country. The herring industry did suffer a bit of a crisis in the later Middle Ages, partly due to competition from the Netherlands, but it survived and went strong for many years after that. In its record year of 1913, you had over 1,000 boats, 1,163 boats involved in the industry, and they caught 1,200 million fish.
Goodness.
It's a lot of fish. You can see why Charles Dickens was so keen to describe the smell. The industry really began to shrink after the mid-20th century to the point where it just doesn't really exist anymore. But there's still a legacy that's there today in the Time and Tide Museum, which is the old herring works there, plus the Lydia Eva, which was the last remaining steam drifter from the herring fishing fleet, which is now a floating museum of the herring industry, and you can book trips out to sea on it as well. But before we talk a bit more about what you can see today, another thing I want to bring up is something called the Scots Girls, as they were locally known, who were kind of this mass migratory workforce who'd come every year from northeast Scotland, Shetland and Lewis, women of all ages who kind of follow the fishing trade around the country and come down to work on a seasonal basis. You'd have as many as 6,000 of these women coming down per year who'd come to gut and salt the fish. And they were really kind of almost a tourist attraction in their own right. People would actually come to Yarmouth and watch them work. They were known as silver darlings sometimes because of all the scales that used to stick to them throughout their work. And they had this kind of almost exotic romantic appeal. They appeared in romantic fiction of the time. There's documentary film of them, there's photographs and artwork. So there's really a tremendous record of their presence in Great Yarmouth.
It's because the industry went on into the 20th century. There's still photos, and you can get lots of information on this industry that went on for centuries, and it really was thriving. I think the maximum catch was just on the eve of the First World War. I understand that 90% of the catch in 1911 was being exported to Germany and Russia, which explains why the wars had such a devastating effect on the industry. You can get a real sense of this industry today at the Time and Tide Museum, the award-winning museum. It's got a really excellent exhibit on herring, and the museum has built itself into a curing works. And also, as well as leaving us with these curing works, it's also left us with other buildings that you can see. There's an ice house, densely built up rows, very narrow rows are also a legacy of the constraint of such a large and busy industry onto such a small space. And you can also see, as you say, the Lydia Eva, which is moored usually at South Quay. So this is on the Yare-facing side of Yarmouth, the west-facing side. And Lydia Eva's got an interesting history. Bought by the Royal Air Force in 1939, and as you say, it can be visited, and it will be starring in a new movie in 2023, the new Willy Wonka movie. So the Lydia Eva, yes, it's been, unfortunately, I think this is a bit of a shame. It's been towed to Lyme Regis for the filming.
Oh, that's a shame.
An attraction of Great Yarmouth. So obviously the herring industry has declined. Have any other industries come forth to replace? What other sort of innovations have we had in Yarmouth?
Yarmouth was historically important as an export centre, mainly for East Anglian agricultural produce. This was particularly in the 18th century and before. It had a major advantage of geography because it was easily reachable through the Broads by water navigation. So hugely important there. We've talked also about the importance of the shipbuilding industry before that in the Middle Ages. Since then, I think the energy industry is kind of the modern day success story. There's North Sea oil, there's natural gas supplies. There's also the offshore wind and renewable energy, including at Scroby Sands Wind Farm. If you go to next to one of the piers in Great Yarmouth, there's a Scroby Sands Wind Farm visitor centre. It tells you all about this wind farm, which you can see from the coast, which is built on this sand spit just off the coast. You can actually book a trip out there as well. You can see the wind farm itself, but also all the seals that gather on this sand spit. Oh. And that area is also pretty notorious for shipwrecks. Lots of shipwrecks have occurred on it, so there's probably still some of those down below you.
I think we're ready to go on to the optical telegraph system.
Oh, the optical telegraph, you read my mind. There was what we're talking about here is an early optical telegraph system which was set up between Great Yarmouth and London in 1808. This was one of 3 routes for communication between the Admiralty in London and important other naval bases. So obviously, with the fleet being based in Great Yarmouth during the Napoleonic Wars, quick, fast communication was important. It was actually closed down at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814. But we'll talk a little bit how this works. An optical telegraph system basically means it's controlled by sight. You have various communication poles essentially set up at various locations along the route between London and Great Yarmouth. And if someone wants to get a message, they'll put the message on the pole, twist it round so it can be seen, and then the next communication pole can see it. That twists around, and the message just gets along essentially by a long chain. Well, to my knowledge, there's no remnant of that left, but it's a pretty interesting remnant of its, I suppose, naval and industrial history.
So I think now it's time to go on to the scores. I'm going to give Yarmouth a positive score because I think being a global centre of any industry is significant, and particularly when there's remains that you can still see. And we've just discussed that the quality of the museums and the mark that the herring industry's left on the urbanism. So I think there's a few interesting things there. So I'm going to give it a 6.
I'm going to temper it down to a 5. The reason for that is there's lots that's positive here. It's hugely important to one particular industry and became nationally, maybe to some extent internationally significant because of that, which is similar to what we saw, say, with the biscuit industry in our Reading episode or railways in the Swindon episode. And I think it's also fantastic that, like Swindon, it celebrates its industrial heritage. The reason I'm tempering it a bit is because this is science and industry. There's not much to talk about on the science side, apart from, I suppose, the optical telegraph system. But it wasn't a world first, as interesting as it was. And I think you'd have to say perhaps the same about the industrial side as well. Although it's important, there hasn't been kind of a world first, the genesis of any industry, which is one of our usual points that we make, that when you come onto places which were kind of the genesis, the birthplace of a particular industry or the Industrial Revolution, which we will come on to in other episodes, those are where the really high scores come in. But 5 is the middle of the road for us. It's not a negative score. So, yeah, 5 for me and 6 for you.
Urban heritage. In this section, we talk about the architecture, streets, and general presentation of the town we visit. This is really the category with the most to see in the town. And Yarmouth is a real treat here. Now, we've already discussed many of the seaside cultural icons. So could we talk a bit about the other buildings in Yarmouth and the periods of history that they represent?
One of the key attractions, I think, of Yarmouth's urban landscape is the fact that it has an architectural heritage of buildings from right across really the entire sweep of British history. It barely has a period weakness. It has Roman forts, as we mentioned earlier. It has hugely extensive medieval walls surviving, some of the most extensive surviving medieval town walls in the entire country. I think 2/3 of them still survive today. It has churches from the Middle Ages. It has Tudor, Stuart, Georgian, and important Victorian Edwardian buildings. There are many examples we can give of those, but I think I want to give that kind of overarching point that there is so much from so many different periods that survives in Great Yarmouth. It's very easy to go to the town and just see the seafront and think, well, that's all it is. But no, you set back from that. You have this old, originally medieval town centre, which so much progressive architectural development has taken place.
You've got to go over to the other side of the town to see that. So there's a concentration of interesting buildings around the quays on the west side of the town. So you've got buildings like the Port and Haven Commissioner's Office, the Custom House, the Elizabethan House. Are there any other buildings that are real highlights for you?
Well, just around there, you've also got the Fisherman's Hospital, which is now Grade 1 listed, built in 1702. It's now converted into almshouses around a courtyard and really looks pretty much the same as it would have done 300 years ago, so that's definitely worth a look at. Specific buildings, St George's Chapel is a real favourite of mine. This is an old chapel that's now been converted into a theatre right in the centre of the original kind of medieval town of Great Yarmouth. It's a really great example of English Baroque religious architecture. It's Grade 1 listed. It's part of a kind of regeneration of the old part of Yarmouth during this great period of urban regeneration and rebuilding that happened in the 18th century, really around the same time as many other major urban centres were being restored. It was built in 1714. It closed for worship in the 20th century and opened later as a theatre, but was recently renovated with a new pavilion, a cafe and a ticket office. It actually won a regional award from the Royal Institute of British Architects in 2014. But I think for me, the reason I love this building so much is how unique looking it is. It's really unusual to see the curvaceous nature of English Baroque architecture that you'll see in, say, someone like St Paul's Cathedral in London, but done in this Georgian red brickwork, this kind of uniquely Georgian building fabric. It just doesn't look like any other Georgian building that you will see from around this time. It's much more in that Baroque style of being curvy rather than straight-lined and pedimented. So it's a neoclassical design, but a much more unique one than you would tend to see in buildings from that era.
So I think some other highlights, the Toll House, which dates from the 12th century, I believe.
That's right.
Absolutely ancient. One of England's oldest surviving municipal buildings, and was at some point a jail. I don't know if you can get inside that.
I think you generally can, but it was closed when I went, unfortunately.
And then we've got the Greyfriars Cloisters.
The cloisters, that's the old 13th century friary that still has remnants there. So yeah, lots of early medieval buildings there. But I think we should talk about the town walls as well a bit more. I think we mentioned them earlier. These are, as we mentioned, hugely extensive in how much has survived. They actually date from the 13th century as well. Henry III originally gave consent to the walls and the prison at the same time in 1261, but building only actually started in 1285. They were very long, well over a mile long, 2,280 yards, I think, their longest point. 32 feet high, 10 gates and 16 towers. They actually only covered 3 sides of the town in the Middle Ages because you had the river on the 4th side, which protected the town. They were strengthened later in 1588 due to the threat of Spanish invasion. They were described in 1558 as a flinty ring of 15 towers, which sent out thunder whenever a Spaniard dared to come near. So there's clearly some symbolic importance as well as practical military use there. It actually formed a kind of practical tax-raising purpose as well. It formed a kind of customs barrier for the town. The walls basically controlled access to the town and meant that any merchants coming in or out would have to pay all their tolls and taxes when entering or leaving. And it hasn't really been used for military purposes since the Civil War. They've decayed quite a lot since then. Though even in a decayed state, so much survives that it's still a really, really impressive site today. And one last unique thing about them is just to mention that they're very unusual in as much as contemporary records of their buildings survive. In the British Library today, you can still access the detailed accounts of the local tax, the muirage tax, which was levied to build it, or to build it up further in the 14th century. So impressive, imposing, loads of it survives. Those are really quite a unique feature of Great Yarmouth today.
And I think before we go to the scoring, it's worth describing in a bit more detail the rows. So these are the narrow, historic alleyways. How did these come about?
The original rows were this maze of narrow alleyways, and now a couple of buildings survive which you can visit, but essentially you can still go down these narrow alleyways and see what they were and how the kind of urban buildings of Great Yarmouth looked and how people lived for many centuries. The first surviving mention of them is from 1198, and the buildings themselves many of them came about because of the grand buildings that could be designed by wealthy fishing merchants in the town. Daniel Defoe again described them as magnificent buildings like little palaces. One of the surviving houses today was built in 1720 for John Andrews, who was the greatest herring merchant in Europe. And really what they show is that the economic prosperity of herring fishing was having a really kind of real tangible and impressive impact on the urban fabric of the town. They did suffer lots of damage in the Second World War, it has to be said. So not as much survives today as we would like. And I'd have to say, having visited them for the first time, I was very slightly underwhelmed. I was thinking there would be a little bit more of the buildings around that survived. But essentially, most of the rows themselves are just alleyways. And it gives you a sense of how the town would have been, but to nothing like the extent that you would have seen before the damage in the Second World War. To me, the most impressive aspect of that part of the town is more the old grand merchants' houses that still survive to this day.
No, I agree. I don't think the setting of the presentation today isn't particularly overwhelming. Should we go on to the scores?
I think Great Yarmouth is a real town of surprises. As I said before, you could go to Great Yarmouth for a day out for your entire life, keep going there and completely miss what's in the town centre. And I would have to confess, for a long time, I did. It's one of those towns where if you take the time to move back in, to look at the other side of it, look at the old town set some way back from the touristy parts, you'll see a real contrast in architectural heritage there. As we said, there's buildings from right across the entire sweep of British history. And you can almost see the growth of the town through time. You can see how it has crept towards the sea as the town has physically grown, the land on which it's built has physically grown. You can see this kind of progression through age. You've got further in the west, you've got the Roman fort, you've got the medieval buildings, the Georgian buildings, and then finally the kind of Victorian and 20th century buildings that come out after that as you go more towards the east. So I think what's great about Great Yarmouth is not just what's there, but how it tells a really interesting and idiosyncratic story with the way that its buildings are set out in that particular way. So for me, its parts are great, but I think it's even greater than the sum of its parts. So for me, I'm going to give it a 7. Now,
I agree with all that, but I have one big problem with Yarmouth, and that is that I couldn't honestly recommend a visit to Yarmouth without first saying and admitting that it is a bit run down. All of those buildings are amazing to see, and it's a great time visiting, and there's stuff you can do. You can go in the museums, Time and Tide, Elizabethan House, but there is a feeling of grottiness in places, and partly that is a legacy of many English maritime towns and industrial towns, particularly because of the legacy of the bombing, but also a legacy, a little bit of 20th century planning as well, and in the case of Yarmouth, probably a lack of prosperity, particularly at the end of the 20th century or when the herring trade collapsed. So you do have all these wonderful buildings, but they're not necessarily presented as well as they could be. Although I think that's an improving situation. We mentioned the Venetian waterways having been restored recently, or the Winter Garden in particular you mentioned. It feels to me like a bit of an unpolished gem, but I'm going to give it a positive score. I'm going to give it 6.5. And now for our final scoring category. It's reality versus expectations.
The idea is that we want to give every town recognition for how much it punches above or even below its weight. We know that certain towns or cities, just by virtue of their size, are going to have a real heft in all categories. But we also want to give some kind of recognition to the towns and cities which aren't so big but have something unique in their own right to offer.
And I think Yarmouth does particularly well in this category. Even my knowledge of Yarmouth, someone I've visited many times, as you say, you go to the resort and it's known as a resort. It's known as a bit of a, rundown seaside resort to a lot of people. But I think when you get there, there's so much more to see. And the fact that it's got these two contrasting faces, you can spend a lot of time there. There's lots to do. So I think it exceeds my expectations. This is a relatively small town. And I think a lot of people don't know so much about these other dimensions of its history. And that collection of buildings from all ages that you've mentioned in the last section. I think there's so much to talk about in Yarmouth, so much to do. I'd give it a positive score here, an 8.
Right, 8. That's
a high score.
Very impressive. I think that's its highest score in any category so far. But I think one of the important things here is going back to one of the first things I said in this episode. Great Yarmouth's population is 40,000. It's the third largest town in a county which is not exactly known for large towns. It's probably the smallest place we've reviewed so far, but it hasn't had a weak score in any category. But it's really performed strongly, or the very least solidly, in absolutely everything. And it has an enormous strength in its leisure heritage. For me, that's the big takeaway from Great Yarmouth. Its leisure heritage is absolutely unique. And what I've enjoyed here is the fact we've been able to talk about the leisure heritage of the poor, the working classes, or the mass population, however you want to call it, and which is something that you and I have both shared in and serve our families, something that we have a personal connection with. Moving away from talking about the leisure heritage of Georgian aristocrats as we did in Bath, which is still important, there's something for me that's a little bit more of a direct connection when talking about Great Yarmouth. And I think our appreciation of this will only grow as we get older and we move further away from this kind of entertainment heritage as we start to lack more of it in the future. But even more than that, there's still so much more beneath the surface of Great Yarmouth. There's, as we've said, such a variety of architecture there, an interesting urban layout to the town as it moves from west to east, a nationally important industry which is very importantly still celebrated today. There's such a great celebration in its, not just through museums, but in the way you can actually enjoy these rides that were built close to 100 years ago today in Pleasure Beach and Joyland and the fun fairs in Great Yarmouth. So for me, there is something really special and striking here. So it's definitely going to be a positive score from me. I'm going to give it a 7.5.
7.5, that's a brilliant score.
It is. So
right, I do need to re-emphasise this to listeners because I don't want the... I think we have to accept, though, as much as there is so much to see in Yarmouth, when you come out of the station and you cross over into the town, if it's a rainy day, it's not the most attractive of places. It looks run down in places, but there is so much once you involve yourself in the town.
Well, that's because the station is miles away from the town. They actually had a better station, or better located station, Yarmouth Beach, which the remnants are still there today, actually. They're near the football ground on the right next to the coast. But unfortunately, I think that may have been collected to the Middle and the Great Northern, which was in the muddle and go nowhere. So it wasn't particularly useful, unfortunately. But it still sits there.
It winded around Norfolk. It's quite a good score overall. I don't know if you've been able to add it up.
I have. Its total score is 66.5 out of a possible total of 100. So just to emphasise on here, as you probably gathered already, 5 is our average. We don't take 7 as an average or anything like that. We go directly, we start at 5 and go up or down. So this is definitely a good score for Yarmouth.
Well, that's all we have time for in this episode. Time flies. So much to cover in Great Yarmouth. Thanks for joining us, though, and I hope we've inspired you to visit Yarmouth. As ever, please do get in touch with any thoughts on this episode or any other via the website yeoldeguide.com. Please check out our other episodes. We've been to Coventry, Reading, Swindon, Chester, Bath, and we've got many more to come. Ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts are always welcome too. In our next episode, we'll be leaving the coast and travelling up to West Yorkshire to Wakefield. A very interesting episode. See you then.